The first thing they noticed was that she didn't belong. June Kim stepped off the transport truck and into the blistering Nevada heat wearing worn boots, a sun-faded backpack, and a loose field shirt that had clearly seen better days. Around her, soldiers in high-tech gear and crisp insignias glanced over with barely veiled smirks, their laughter slicing the air like knives. One muttered that they must have started accepting janitors now. Another joked, "She looked like someone's aunt who wandered onto a training base." Nobody even bothered to ask who she was. They assumed everything from the calluses on her hands to the weathered hat shielding her face screamed civilian, weak, useless. At Iron Range Survival Program, reputation arrived before you did. It was a brutal joint military challenge known for breaking even seasoned officers. Recruits were handpicked from elite forces vetted by years of special ops experience. June had no visible rank, no record. No one could figure out how she ended up on the list. That mystery only fueled the ridicule. The medical intake officer barely looked up from her clipboard when June checked in. When asked for a reference, June handed over a folded paper with a generic authorization code. The woman read it, then scoffed and mumbled something about the program needing a few early dropouts to keep the stats honest. That was the kindest comment she'd get that day. By the time gear was assigned, her name had already become a whispered punchline. A few French and American officers swapped her clean water for salty brine. Someone slipped extra rocks into her pack. They took bets on how long she'd last. Most said 2 days. One said 1. No one said she'd finish. No one even imagined she'd survive. Later that night, without warning, June was pulled aside under the pretense of base support. A private drove her in silence across empty canyon roads, saying nothing as the terrain grew rougher and the stars colder. He stopped at a dry, rocky gully. Without looking at her, he handed her a dented canteen, half full of bitter liquid, and pointed east. Then he drove off without another word, leaving her in the dark with no radio, no map, and no backup. She stood still for a long time, the dry wind tugging at her sleeves. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled. The silence wasn't kind. It was the kind that waited to see who you really were when no one was watching. June didn't panic. She didn't scream. She adjusted her backpack, glanced at the horizon, and started walking. They had tried to erase her, but she knew something they didn't. She had not come this far to disappear. June Kim never needed attention to feel worthy. She was born in a quiet corner of Arizona, the daughter of a Korean-American mechanic and a Mongolian immigrant who raised her with the kind of wisdom that never came from books. Her world was dust heat and hard work. While other kids played indoors, June hauled feed across dry fields with her father barefoot some summers, learning that endurance wasn't something you shouted about. It was something you proved quietly every single day. Her grandmother came to live with them when June was 10. She didn't speak much English, but she spoke survival. She showed June how to spot water by the bend of a leaf or track movement from a change in the dirt. She taught her to listen to wind patterns, to boil herbs for fevers, to respect fire, but never fear it. Their backyard became a classroom. Not a single certificate came from those lessons, but they would one day matter more than any military medal. June was never the loudest voice in a room, and she didn't mind that. She'd been underestimated since she was a child, overlooked in classrooms, skipped over at work, and mistaken for someone fragile more times than she could count. But she carried herself with the kind of stillness that made you look twice if you were paying attention. She didn't chase status. She pursued competence. And in her world, that meant being prepared, knowing more than she showed, and never folding under pressure. Before Iron Range, she'd spent years doing humanitarian fieldwork in unstable regions, serving as a combat medic with no official title. She had stitched wounds by flashlight in makeshift tents, carried children across floodwaters, and stood between rebels and aid workers more than once. But none of that came with uniforms or rank. She worked in the background, because that's where people got saved quietly. She didn't post pictures. She didn't seek medals. When asked about her experience, she said she was just someone who helped where she could. That simplicity made others dismiss her, even those who should have known better. The military didn't know where to file a woman like her. Not on paper, not in protocol. What June understood better than most was that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't ask for applause. It shows up when the world turns hostile, when your gear fails, when your map blows away, and your only compass is instinct. And her instinct had been sharpened over a lifetime. She didn't own much. Her boots were repaired 3 times. Her pack had a stitched-up seam from Cambodia. Her jacket once belonged to her father, worn at the elbows and sun-bleached at the shoulders. But she wore it like armor. It reminded her where she came from, and more importantly, who she didn't need to impress. When she walked into Iron Range, she didn't expect a warm welcome. She didn't expect kindness. But she also didn't expect permission. June never waited for people to believe in her. She carried her belief on her back, in her breath, and in the dirt beneath her fingernails. She had no rank, no entourage, just the kind of quiet preparation that turns survival into second nature. Iron Range didn't pretend to be fair. It wasn't built to teach. It was built to break. The facility stretched across miles of scorched terrain where jagged stone met open sky and the sun punished everything that moved. Recruits weren't welcomed. They were dropped in, stripped of comfort, and pushed until something inside them cracked. Each morning began before sunrise with a siren that rattled your bones. The air smelled like sweat metal and grit. Recruits ran uphill with packs filled with sand, did drills until their elbows bled, then crawled across gravel under barking instructors who only acknowledged perfection. Water was rationed. Sleep was earned. Kindness didn't exist. The people here weren't strangers to power. These were elite soldiers from around the world. Navy SEALs, SAS, IDF, Katusa. Each carried a background thick with accomplishments and a chip on their shoulder that said no one else was worthy. They eyed each other with territorial tension. But when June Kim showed up, their attention shifted fast. She became the common target. She didn't wear branded tactical gear. Her boots were dusty and repaired. Her bag sagged like it had seen too many seasons. She didn't carry herself with bravado. She walked in quietly, eyes down, posture neutral. That silence was read as weakness. That simplicity as incompetence. It didn't take long before the mockery started. Someone left a spoon in her boots overnight. Another poured salt into her water flask and watched from across the mess tent as she choked on the first sip. Her pack was mysteriously heavier each day, loaded with rocks no one owned up to. And when assignments were announced, she was always listed last. The ones who sabotaged her didn't even try to hide it. They laughed in groups and made sure she heard. In a place where reputation mattered more than rules, June had none. No past to prove, no badges on her chest, no one to vouch for her. She was treated as a background object like the tents or the dust, forgotten unless needed for a joke. But she watched. Every insult, every prank, she filed it away. She didn't push back. She didn't complain. Instead, she timed her runs, mapped the terrain in her head, and tested the water filters for weak points. She memorized routines, wane shifts, supply drop patterns. She didn't shout to be seen. She studied to survive. During drills, while others shouted commands or tried to impress instructors, she moved with steady rhythm. No flair, just function. Her lungs burned the same as theirs, but she didn't curse. She focused on breath, on movement, on finishing. She remembered her father's voice, calm and sharp, telling her, "The ones who waste breath on pride rarely finish the job." At night, the recruits gathered to brag or complain. June sat alone, patching her torn gloves or retying the broken laces that someone had sliced. The desert wind rattled the canvas above her, whispering through every seam of the camp. She didn't speak of revenge or justice. She spoke to no one, but her eyes stayed open long after others slept. The instructors didn't care to intervene. In fact, some seemed amused. One of them muttered that she wouldn't make it to day 3. Another said she'd be a good cautionary tale. The others just watched, waiting for her to crack. But she didn't. She simply kept showing up, covered in dust, hands blistered, steady. She was the only one they didn't see coming, and that's exactly how she wanted it. When team assignments were announced, June's name wasn't called. One by one, squads were formed, 5 or 6 soldiers per group, each handed an envelope of coordinates and expected to navigate through the desert for the next phase. June stood quietly at the edge, her name still untouched on the clipboard. An instructor shrugged and said they'd sort her out later. The smirk on his face wasn't hard to miss. Neither was the glance exchanged with the sub-lieutenant beside him. By late afternoon, while others were disappearing into the landscape in their units, June was loaded onto a supply truck without explanation. No map, no clear briefing, just her small, battered pack tossed beside her on the metal floor. The vehicle rumbled across miles of nothing, its tires grinding against the sand as the sun dropped lower in the sky. When it finally stopped, she was told to get out. The private who had been driving didn't even look at her. He pointed toward the ridgeline and said the usual half-smirked good luck, then slammed the door and drove off. She stood in the fading light with no idea how far she was from camp. The sky was already bleeding orange and violet. Her water tasted metallic and wrong. She took a cautious sip, swished it in her mouth, then spat it out. Too salty. Sabotaged. Her canteen had a hairline crack that would never hold under pressure. Someone had planned this. Not carelessness. Intention. For a moment she said nothing. Did nothing. Just let the silence settle. There were no tracks. No markers. Just stone dust and a sharp wind coming down off the slope. Her boots sank slightly into loose sand as she shifted her stance. A flicker of old instinct kicked in. Not fear. Focus. She scanned the shadows, noted the angle of the sun, measured the dip in temperature on her skin. She pulled out her pack. Supplies were light. Too light. Rations were short, and most had expired dates. The compass was gone. She ran her fingers slowly along the seams of her gear, checking what she had left that still worked. Half a spool of twine, a small tin for boiling water, a strip of cloth. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Her breath stayed steady. There were no orders to follow, no radios, no one watching to report back to. But June didn't see that as a loss. She saw it for what it was. A chance. The same kind of chance her grandmother once told her about, when nobody expects anything from you and you get to move in silence. She tied a knot around the base of her cracked canteen, reinforcing it with strips from her sleeve. She shifted her weight and turned her back on the road the truck had vanished down. The stars were already starting to show. There would be no tents tonight, no fire, just dry, cold air and the quiet sound of sand scraping under her soles. She adjusted the strap across her chest and began walking east, hugging the edge of a canyon wall. They had left her here, to break. She didn't plan to give them the satisfaction. June didn't panic the first night. She found a shallow depression near a rocky outcrop and used it as wind cover. The ground was cold, but she remembered how her grandmother used to cover herself in damp clay to stay warm in the mountains. She smeared a thin layer of mud across her exposed arms and legs, then packed dry grass over herself for insulation. It wasn't comfortable, but it held back the chill enough to let her sleep for a few hours at a time. By morning, the thirst hit harder than the hunger. Her tongue felt dry, her cracked canteen nearly empty. But she didn't drink it yet. She scanned the horizon for signs of life. Birds meant water. Insects meant moisture. She spotted a patch of wild grass growing in a crease between two boulders. That told her everything. She dropped to her knees and dug with a rock patient steady until the ground turned damp. She waited. Slowly, brackish water seeped in. She strained it through her shirt to catch sediment, then boiled it in the small tin she'd saved for just this purpose. The taste was bitter, but it kept her upright. She moved only during the early morning or just before dusk, conserving energy. During the day, she stayed in the shade, using her old jacket to form a lean-to against the rock. Her body ached from the weight of stillness. But she knew it was better than wasting strength in heat that burned from the inside out. By day 3, she needed food. The hunger had sharpened her senses. She used twine from her pack and a bent wire pulled from her bra to make a snare. She placed it near a set of faint tracks by a dry bush, where something small had passed more than once. She waited nearby, motionless, barely breathing. The rabbit was young fast, but it made the same mistake twice. Her snare tightened around its leg before it had time to cry out. She didn't hesitate. She knew what had to be done. She skinned it quickly, quietly, the way her father taught her when they used to hunt on weekends for extra meat. She cooked the meat over a slow flame, careful to keep the fire low and smokeless. It was tough and gamey, but it gave her just enough to keep moving. Waste nothing. That was the rule. Each night she covered herself in a new mix of mud ash and leaves, building better insulation as she learned what worked. Each morning she studied the wind, the clouds, the slope of the land. She marked direction using sun angles, adjusting course by memory, always keeping the canyon wall on her left. Her feet blistered, her lips cracked. But she kept going hour by hour, not out of defiance, but because survival was a habit she refused to break. She never cried. Not once. Not when the cold wrapped around her like wire. Not when the silence grew too wide. She thought of her grandmother's voice telling her the desert doesn't hate or help. It just watches. June never asked for rescue. She never counted on being found. She only trusted her own hands, her own pace, and the quiet thread of knowledge passed down by women who had survived worse with less. June spotted him near the edge of a dry ravine, his body half collapsed against a boulder, one leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. At first she wasn't sure he was real. The heat played tricks. But when she moved closer and saw the rise and fall of his chest, the gash on his thigh, and the way his lips were cracked with dehydration, she knew he didn't have long. He was burning with fever, eyes rolling, murmuring nonsense in a voice stripped of all command. She recognized him. Captain Min's South Korean Special Forces. He was one of the loudest voices that had laughed at her back on day one. She didn't pause. She knelt beside him, resting her fingers on his pulse. Weak, but there. She rummaged through her small kit, took out a strip of shirt she had saved as bandage, and soaked it in her precious water. She cleaned the wound slowly, rinsing sand and infection from the torn skin. He flinched, at first tried to push her hand away, but his body was too far gone to resist. She whispered to him in soft Korean words her grandmother used to say when June was sick as a child. Simple things. Just enough to quiet the panic in his eyes. His fingers trembled when she pressed the cloth to his lips, offering a measured sip. Not too much. Just enough to keep him conscious. She tied the bandage tightly and checked his breathing. Shallow. Still fighting. She dragged him with care beneath a rock overhang that caught just enough shade. There she built a small windbreak from loose branches and tied his leg to a brace she shaped from dry wood. He moaned once in pain, then fell into a restless sleep. June sat beside him and wrapped her arms around her knees, keeping watch. The sun dipped low again. Coyotes howled. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning he stirred. His eyes fluttered open and landed on her face. Confusion crossed his features. Then shame. His voice rasped something she couldn't quite hear. She handed him more water, steadier this time, and he drank it slowly, not meeting her eyes. He didn't ask why she helped. She didn't offer an answer. They didn't need words for this part. He watched her silently as she cleaned his bandage and crushed dry leaves into a powder she dabbed along the edge of the wound. Her movements were efficient, focused. There was no need for revenge. No interest in proving a point. Just the instinct to keep another human alive. That quiet grace hit him harder than any lecture would have. He tried to sit up later, wincing as his muscles protested. June caught him before he tipped, steadying his shoulder with the same calmness she used on her snares and fire pits. He didn't argue. He didn't joke. He just nodded slightly and said, "Thank you," in a voice too soft for pride. June said nothing. She gathered more water that day, rationed her food, and watched the wind. The desert was still unforgiving, but for the first time she wasn't entirely alone. In the eyes of the man who once saw her as a mistake, there was now something else. Respect. Maybe even trust. She didn't need it. But it was there, and it was real. 2 days after rescuing the Korean officer, June was scouting near a dry streambed when she saw something strange in the sand. At first it looked like another pile of gear tossed aside by the wind, but as she got closer she saw the faint rise and fall of a chest. The body was face down, one arm, outstretched fingers, curled into the dirt. She turned him gently and felt the heat radiating from his skin. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. It was the Israeli major. She remembered him from camp. He had barely glanced at her when they passed. Now his body was slick with sweat and burning with fever. She didn't waste time. She called for the Korean officer who limped over and helped move him into their makeshift shelter. The major's arm was swollen, and when she unwrapped the cloth around it, the smell told her everything. The cut was infected deep. There were no antibiotics, no clean medical tools. But she'd seen this before years ago. Her grandmother had taught her how to fight infection when medicine ran out. She left the men in the shade and walked half a mile to a slope where green flecks dotted the dust. She dug with her bare hands, pulling up a handful of leaves she crushed between two stones. Back at the shelter, she boiled a paste in a tin lid, mixed it with water, then dabbed the mix onto the wound while the major shivered beneath his torn jacket. His body resisted at first. He mumbled through his teeth, tried to push her hand away. June held his wrist gently and kept working. The Korean officer sat nearby, watching in silence. His eyes followed every step. He knew now that her calm wasn't luck. It was something earned. By nightfall, the major's fever had dropped just enough to stop the shaking. June used her last clean strip of cloth to cool his forehead, then gave him a sip of strained water. She whispered in Hebrew just a few words her grandmother had once used with a traveler long ago. He blinked. For a moment, he looked at her like he was seeing something unfamiliar. Not weakness, not confusion, but authority. The next day she checked the wound again. Less swelling, less heat. She fed both men scraps from her last snare catch, dividing the meat without speaking. They followed her hands, waited for her signals. She was leading, and they knew it. Not because she demanded control, but because she moved with purpose, because she didn't flinch. When the sun rose, she showed them how to stack branches to create a smoke signal, not high enough to draw early detection, but strong enough to mark their presence if needed. The Korean officer asked how she learned all this. June just smiled faintly and said it was old knowledge passed down by people who had no maps but still found their way. The men didn't laugh. They didn't speak much at all. They just listened now. And in the way they carried their gear, the way they looked to her before moving, the change was clear. They were no longer surviving in spite of her. They were surviving because of her. On the morning of day 19, a scout team spotted movement near the southern edge of Iron Range. They expected another dropout, maybe someone too dehydrated to speak. What they saw instead was June Kim walking upright, though her gait was uneven and one boot was split at the sole. Her face was streaked with dirt, her pack half unraveled, but her eyes were steady. No escort, no radio call, just her. The moment she crossed into the base perimeter, silence rippled through the camp. Soldiers stood still mid-task. A few instructors exchanged stunned glances. No one had expected her to survive, let alone return. Word spread quickly, bouncing between tents and comm units. The woman they had dismissed had made it back on foot after almost 2 weeks alone in the desert. And not only that, she had brought back 2 injured officers alive. The commanding officer, a grizzled Marine colonel with 30 years in the field, demanded verification. Reports from the reconnaissance team confirmed her account. The Korean and Israeli officers still in recovery gave their full statements. They credited her with saving their lives. They didn't embellish. They didn't need to. The facts were enough. The base entered a quiet state of shock. Recruits who had mocked her now whispered her name with disbelief. Some called it a fluke. Others kept their heads low, already regretting the comments they once made. Instructors reviewed survival logs and realized June had not only completed the entire challenge, but had logged perfect self-reliance under hostile conditions. No external support, no aid. During the evening debrief, the colonel gathered everyone in the central quad. His voice cut through the dry air with a mix of disbelief and admiration. He spoke of survival of discipline, and then without ceremony called June forward. She stepped out from the shadows, still wearing her patched jacket, hands calm at her sides. She looked smaller than the others, quieter, but somehow more present. The colonel read the results aloud. She had scored higher than any participant in program history. He paused and let the weight of that fact sink in. Then, for the first time in Iron Range protocol, he ordered official apologies to be submitted from anyone involved in sabotage. Recruits, who once ridiculed her, now stood in line to sign written statements. Eyes lowered. June said nothing as they approached. She nodded once. That was enough. The colonel asked if she wanted recognition, a medal, a public commendation. June looked out at the recruits, some still watching her like they weren't sure if she was real. She shook her head. She didn't need an award. What she wanted instead was to stay. Just long enough to help train incoming women so they wouldn't have to fight through ridicule just to be seen. There was a pause, a few grumbles from the back, but the colonel nodded. He agreed. Her request was granted without debate. It was the least they could do. That night, the atmosphere at camp changed. It was subtle, but it was there, in the way people moved aside to give her space. In the way even the most decorated officers glanced at her with something close to respect. June didn't linger in the spotlight. She returned to her tent, cleaned her gear, and prepared notes for the new recruits. Her walk through fire had changed the rules not by force but by example. She didn't demand a seat at the table. She built one and invited others in. And that quiet power echoed long after the noise faded. June stayed on quietly. No title, no ceremony. She worked alongside new recruits, showing them how to track shadows for direction and use silence as signal. She taught them to listen to the ground, feel changes in wind, and keep their breath steady in fear. Her lessons were simple, not polished. But they stayed with people, especially the women who arrived unsure if they belonged. Word of her spread beyond Iron Range, not through news reports or interviews. She declined every request. She didn't want her face in articles or her name printed in bold. She told the colonel once that survival doesn't need a spotlight. It only needs to be passed on. What she left behind wasn't a speech or a medal. It was a handwritten notebook filled with small sketches, field techniques, and quiet advice. She had copied it by hand on spare ration paper tied with a strip from her old jacket. It wasn't official, but it moved from locker to locker, generation to generation. Those pages were read by lantern light and committed to memory before the first march. The culture of the base began to shift, slowly without announcement. Recruits talked less about proving worth through rank and more about being steady when it mattered. Men who had once laughed now stopped to ask questions. Some just watched in silence as she trained, unsure how to put into words the change she caused. One cold morning just before the next cycle began, June packed her bag. She left the patch she'd been given tucked beneath her sleeping mat. The only thing she carried was the jacket and her boots. When someone asked where she was going, she smiled and said there were still places to see and people who hadn't yet been told they were strong. No farewell was planned. She slipped out as she came in. Quiet. Light-footed. Behind her, the base returned to routine, but something had settled into its bones, a respect that couldn't be ordered, only earned. At night, when fires crackled and boots were finally still, recruits told stories in low voices, of the woman who walked back from the desert, of the men she saved with boiled herbs and split water, of the one they once called a joke who taught them what leadership really looked like. No one shouted her name. They didn't need to. In the places that mattered, it had already been carved into the dust.